Hi guys, hope everybody's doing great. Welcome to our lesson. Today we are going to look at one of the axial skeletal part of the human support system, and that is the vertebral column. Now we mentioned that apart from the skull and the rib cage, this and the sternum, this vertebral column forms part of the axial uh, skeleton part of the human support system, and this play different roles as we're going to see later by trying to discuss these different parts that I've given for the lateral and the anterior view of this specific part of the human support system. Now, the vertebral column consists of bones that I already mentioned, which are referred to as a vertebrae, therefore giving it the name the vertebral column. Now, apart from the vertebrae, we're going to see that a vertebrae consists of 24 bones, which are articulated from this lower part of the skull to the pelvis. And in addition to that, we have what we call the sacrum and the coccyx, which forms part of this vertebral column that I'm illustrating. In some literature, we're going to see this one being referred to as the spine. So therefore, in any case, if we come across that one, we're going to understand that this is in reference to what we have already mentioned. Now, this vertebral column extends from this specific point that I said, which is the base of the skull. And we're going to see that, of course, when we're going to discuss about these two specific bones for the atlas and, of course, axis, which I mentioned in one of our videos, which we're going to discuss in a different video. So therefore, it extends from the base of the skull to the pelvis, which is the lower part of the appendicular skeleton that we are trying to illustrate here. Now, the spinal cord passes from this specific point, which is, of course, the foramen magnum of the part of the skull through to the vertebral, through to the, within the vertebral column, in what we are going to see later, which is an allowance in between these specific bones. We're going to give it a name later. And then we're going to see that the spine, basically, which I've mentioned, which sometimes can be referred to the vertebral column, holds the head in position to allow for a nodding and, of course, twisting of the head in order to facilitate a movement. Now, in this case, as I've mentioned, apart from the 24 bones that I've mentioned, which form part of the vertebral column, there's a sacrum and the coccyx, which we're going to look at later, perhaps using or trying to figure out how it looks in its shape and its particular adaptations. So in this case, as I've said, the vertebral column consists of bones which are referred to as a vertebrae, which are separated from one another by what we call the cartilage that is referred to as intervertebral discs, which I'm going to show, maybe perhaps the one that is illustrated in light gray color, which we're going to see later in a different video. These discs act as shock absorbers and they reduce friction during movement of this specific part of the spinal or the spine, and therefore allowing for a flexible or flexibility during movement. So therefore, we are going to see that this vertebral column is made up of different types of bones, or as different sets of bones, which are given in this specific colors that are listed for this screen. This is brown, and then this pink, and the blue ones, and the violet by this specific end. So this is a set of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 bones. So therefore, the first one is referred to, first set of bones, which is upper part, is referred to the cervical vertebrae, which is shown, of course, using this specific part of a view, this right part of our board. And then we have next what we call the thoracic vertebrae, which is a range of bones which are shown from this specific point to this particular point. And then we have a range of bones from this particular part and the lower one, which is a lumbar vertebrae. And then lastly, we have the sacrum and the coccyx. So therefore, in this case, we're going to see that these bones display different features, of course, of physical appearance in order to assist them perform their functions as far as their location at these different parts of the skeletal system is concerned. Now, part of those characteristics that we're going to see, which are contained in this, or perhaps which this particular bones contain, can be referred to as features, as I've mentioned. And I'm going to mention a few, or rather the main ones, which are going to form part of our discussions in our next videos of this particular range of bones. Perhaps the common ones, as we have said, that the major function of this particular column is to protect the spinal cord, which passes through the allowance that is found inside these specific bones. So the first one is the centrum. They contain what a section that is known as the centrum, and we're going to see that this particular part, which is referred to as the centrum, is the solid structure of the vertebral or the vertebrae, which basically supports the weight of the vertebrae and collectively supports the entire vertebral column. So this section is a solid structure part of this particular bone that is referred to as a centrum, and whose functions I've already mentioned. And then next, they consist of what we call the transverse processes. And these transverse processes, which are lateral projections in relation to the centrum that we have mentioned, which we're going to see later. And these transverse processes provide a service for attachment of muscles and the ligaments that we had mentioned in our first video. Now that the third part of it, apart from the centrum and the transverse process that is displayed by these particular bones, we have what we call a neural canal, which is the allowance that I was referring to, that is connecting between the brain and this part of the skull that runs across, or rather runs downwards from this skull to the lower part of the support system. Now this particular neural canal is a dorsal projection in relation to the centrum, of course, which is going to offer surface area for muscle and ligament attachment, of course, which is going to offer surface area for muscle attachment in this particular case. And in that case, that is for the neurospine. Sorry for that confusion. So we have what we call the neurospine, which is going to provide for projection, which is a projection basically in relation to the centrum that we have mentioned, which offers a surface area for muscle and ligament attachment. And apart from the neurospine, we have what we call the neural canal that forms the fifth part of this feature for this specific parts of the vertebral columns that we've mentioned. Basically, the neural canal is an opening within the vertebrae, whose function is to allow for passage of the spinal cord that we mentioned. Now, apart from that, they have what we call parts which are assisting in joining of these ribs from the front part of the sternum, and those are known as the articular facets. Sometimes they can be referred to as zygapophysis. I hope that the spelling, the mentioning is correct for that, but basically we can refer to them as articular facets, which are of two types, of course, for anterior and the posterior facets respectively. And as I said, these are basically going to perform the function of articulation between the front part and the part which is anterior and the posterior part of this support system that I've mentioned. Now in this case, those are the specific parts of or specific characteristics of these specific columns, the vertebral column that we have mentioned, which of course play a major role in trying to house the spinal cord and articulation of the specific bones, basically of the thoracic cavity and the lower part of the support system, like the pelvis, which we are going to see. So in this case, those processes, or rather the features that I've mentioned, of course, which are contained, or in other words, we're going to refer to them as common basic plans, which are, of course, features displayed by this particular range of bones, which are basically, as I can say in summary, the centrum, the transverse process, the neural canal, articular facets, and the neurospine, which we are going to discuss when we're going to discuss the individual features of these specific bones. Now, in an essence, for the vertebral column, it's of essence for us to understand its functions and the different sets of bones that we have said that it contains, and be in a position to try to identify the cervical vertebrae, the thoracic vertebrae, the lumbar vertebrae, the sacrum, and the coccyx, and the different functions. Now the features that I've mentioned, we're going to discuss them in an exclusive video when we're going to look at this set of bones in an individual way, perhaps using an illustrative picture for us to understand. So basically we shall stop there for the vertebral column, and in our next video we're going to look at these different types of bones of the vertebral column before we move to the parts of the appendicular skeleton that I've mentioned. So basically in us discussing the concept of the rib cage, it's going to form our last bit of the axioskeleton that we are going to look into. So that is it for today, guys. Bye. God bless you.